Our Cabinet has approved the General Intelligence Laws Amendment Bill for tabling before Parliament, and Cosatu promptly condemned the bill as an attempt to undermine the Constitution. And the Labour Federation believes the bill's main objective is to introduce creeping state security through the back door. For more on this, Cosatu's Matthew Parks, who joins us via Zoom. Good afternoon to you, Matthew, and thank you so much for joining us. You're saying that the General Intelligence Laws Amendment Bill is essentially creeping up at the back door to create a security state. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so good afternoon. Look, we're quite shocked that Cabinet actually approved this bill. I think any student who has simply done Constitutional Law 101 would know that this bill is unconstitutional. So there are some parts of the bill which are fine, administrative. For example, establishing the National Intelligence Academy, which has been in existence for many years, that's fine. Separating domestic and foreign intelligence collection, which was there previously as per the Zondo Commission recommendations, that's also fine. But there are two clauses in it which are very dangerous and simply just unconstitutional. The one is to extend the definition of threats to national security to include anything that threatens peace or harmony or equality or freedom from want. Those are very broad, and there could be all manner of things which have no malicious intent which could threaten them. And because it's so broad, those can easily be abused by intelligence and law enforcement officials in the future to persecute all sorts of people who actually have nothing to do with national security threats. National security threats must be limited to issues of violence, terrorism, sabotage, those kind of things, traditional definitions.
Yeah, but what happens now, Matthew, just going forward in terms of the approval by Cabinet, and if the bill is adopted as it stands or ratified by the President, what is the process in terms of making sure that your concerns are also addressed and there isn't just an ambiguity as to what is national threat and who's subjected to police or security investigation?
Yeah, so let me say the other big problem with it is that they want to extend a vetting process that is done by the State Security Agency, normally to senior officials in government. They want to extend it to anybody who wants to found a church or non-governmental organization. A non-governmental organization would include, for example, trade unions, churches, mosques, sports organizations, civic organizations, even political parties. And that is really the biggest fundamental threat. So right now, where it is, the bill has been approved by Cabinet for tabling at Parliament. It hasn't been tabled yet at Parliament. Parliament will obviously have to go through it for public hearings, audit, and so forth. And I can't see Parliament, one, passing such a bill which is so unconstitutional. Of course, organizations will go to Parliament to object to it as well. Parliament also has very little time left to approve it. But from our side as Cosatu, we don't want to see any such nonsensical bill coming to Parliament. We're going to engage the presidency, on whose half it has been drafted by the State Security Agency, to ask them to simply withdraw those two offensive clauses which speak to a very broad, insane definition of national security threats, and also, of course, the extension of state security vetting to NGOs and churches and so forth. We hope that, and we believe that government would see reason to it and would simply remove those offensive clauses. We do know in government itself, there's not consensus around the bill, and in government itself, senior people have raised concerns about the lack of constitution around it. But we think that simply Cabinet was sleeping on the job. They didn't read the bill properly. And those who did read it have a very unusual understanding of what the Constitution entails and how a bill must be constitutional. It also does raise questions to us about the competency of the chief state law advisors for approving such a flawed, insane bill. But nonetheless, we're hoping, we believe we can do so, to engage with the presidency and to have it cleaned up. And then once it's cleaned up, then you can table the rational parts to it, like separating domestic and foreign intelligence, establishing an intelligence academy, and so forth. But I think for our side right now, we are going to engage government and make sure it's cleaned up. We simply just can't afford such an embarrassing saga as a nation when we have so many other issues to deal with, and we're still coming from a decade of state capture, where there was previously attempts to, through the back door, introduce security elements to the state.
I just want to pick up on the element of vetting of NGOs, particularly with churches. We have seen, even with bogus prophets and all sorts of other shenanigans happening in that religious space, where certain unscrupulous individuals take advantage of the vulnerability and the faith of people and then end up exploiting them. That is a necessity, because there has been evidence that if this sector is left to govern itself and is given autonomy, that there is potential, even security threat at that. What's your view?
Yeah, so look, we don't have any problem with regulating parts of civil society. So, for example, as trade unions, We have to register with the Department of Labour. The Registry of Labour oversees the unions, not just the content, but in terms of abiding by the law. Audited financial reports, do we have constitutions, do we abide by our constitutions, do we have democratic congresses to elect leadership and so forth. So we are accountable in that regard. Similarly, many of your NGOs which register with the Department of Social Development also have that kind of regulatory oversight, not in terms of the content and what they do, but in terms of abiding by certain parameters of the law. And that's fine. And there is a legitimate case when you saw, for example, previously some priests basically pickpocketing, exploiting the members of the congregations. You have some priests who wanted to feed people petrol and other bizarre things. So you could, for example, through the Commission of Cultural, Religious, Linguistic Minorities or Communities, etc., develop legislation to oversee, to regulate religious institutions. And you've got to establish that you hear the requirements to be established, to be held accountable and so forth. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, I think you'll find many churches would agree with that. Because they also have been concerned about the abuses. The problem is that if we hand over those kind of oversight tools to state security, that's the big problem. You can't allow state security intelligence officers to vet trade unions, political parties, churches, NGOs, mosques, civic, sports societies. That's a recipe for state security and a huge threat to abuse and undermine the Constitution. NGOs are exactly that. They're non-government organizations. State security must be concerned with government institutions, with nuclear power stations and those kind of things, but not be concerned with sports bodies and churches. And there are processes you can do to regulate those ones, but not to hand it over to state security, because that really will be a problem. And I can't for the life of me see a constitutional court passing such an overstretch of state security's responsibilities and powers.
Yeah, and you're saying that the genesis is because this is also drafted by the state security on the behest of the president, yet it will still go through the process of being thoroughly ventilated with a community having their input as well. What are the unintended consequences of the bill as it stands now, not only to individuals, but where you could potentially be a case of mistaken identity, or that you are, quoted out of context, what you stand for, you could just pose as a national threat to security, unintendedly so?
Yeah, so right now, current threats could be, for example, the extended definition of threats to national security, where it says things which undermine peace and harmony. So theoretically, I could see some bored state security bureaucrats saying, well, a protest by a community about a lack of service delivery is a threat to peace and harmony, because it's so ill-defined. How would you even quantify that and so forth? So that could be a real threat to democracy, to the right to protest, to picket, to political association and so forth. And of course, for state security, to vet people who want to establish an NGO, trade union, that could easily be abused. But by the very nature, NGOs and trade unions, civic organizations will, from time to time, irritate government, will ask awkward questions and so forth, and fall out of favor of people in power. And of course, there will be a natural inclination by those in power to then want to clamp down, to restrict, to suffocate, to disband such organizations. And that will be a real threat to a constitutional democracy. So that for us, it's a no-go area, and precisely that's why these organizations are separated from government. So they have the independence, the autonomy, the ability to express the views of the members without fearing will government approve of it. If governments approve of trade unions, for example, very few trade unions would exist around the world. They're by their nature are noisy, robust creatures. They express the views of their constituency, workers, etc. But they can't be subject to approval by a government, because at times there will be an inherent conflict of interest where trade unions tell government, we don't think you're doing this or that issue right, we're not happy with one or two issues, etc. So I think for us, the potential for abuse is really massive. It's quite scary that Cabinet approved it, and we simply think that perhaps they just were not paying attention. We hope that is the case, because they did approve it. It will really reflect quite badly in terms of the views and understanding of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and how democracy works. But we're convinced it just simply crept through the cracks. People were not paying attention, which is a problem on its own, but hence we're confident we can fix it as well.
All right, Matthew, as always, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate your time. That's Matthew Parks, speaking as the Cosatu Parliamentary Coordinator and acting spokesperson on the bill that has just been introduced or taken or tabled in Parliament, waiting for, of course, interaction, engagement and ventilation before the President will then take a look at it. But that's where we'll leave it now with Matthew Parks.